James had always loved the stillness of libraries. The way the silence wrapped around the shelves, the weight of words held in place by history and paper. These days, the local library had become his refuge, a place to escape the suffocating loneliness that clung to his life like the dust on forgotten books. It had been a year since his wife passed, and since then, his days had become a ritual of quiet isolation. Every morning, James would walk the same path to the library, bypassing the coffee shop where he and Claire used to sit, chatting about the trivialities of the day. Now his world consisted of the rustle of pages and the occasional polite smile exchanged with the librarian, a woman too young to understand the depth of the loss he carried. The library itself was old, a relic from the town's forgotten days of grandeur. The building stood like a sentry, keeping watch over the small park adjacent to it, with tall windows filtering the sunlight in golden shafts that illuminated motes of dust. The faded leather chairs and mahogany tables seemed frozen in time, just like James' life. He liked it here, where no one expected much from him, and where the quiet felt like a companion. It wasn't that James disliked people. He simply didn't know how to be around them anymore. The loss of Claire had fractured something deep within him, and despite the passing months, the pieces never seemed to fall back into place. The library was a refuge from the pitying glances and awkward conversations. Here, surrounded by other people's stories, he could forget his own. Each day, he'd pick up a random book, mostly novels, and sit by the large window. He didn't read much anymore. His mind wandered, flipping through the pages of memories rather than the printed words. He'd often wonder if this was all there was, an endless cycle of loneliness wrapped in quiet rooms. And then, one day, something changed. It was a Tuesday, as unremarkable as any other. James had made his way to the far corner of the library, where the older books sat in shadowed stacks. He preferred it here, away from the small number of people who occasionally passed through. As he pulled out a well-worn copy of a classic novel, something slipped out from the shelf, a small, battered notebook with a faded cover. Curiosity piqued. He opened the notebook and saw that it wasn't a library book all. The pages were filled with handwriting, delicate, slanted script that looked like it belonged to someone young. The ink had faded in places, but the words were legible enough. What he found inside was a series of stories, each one short and poignant, filled with reflections on life, loss, and hope. James felt strange pull as he read. The writing wasn't particularly polished, but it had a rawness to it that spoke to him. It was as if the writer had poured her heart onto the page, using these stories to cope with something deeply painful. He flipped through the pages, and one line in particular stood out to him. Sometimes the stories we leave behind are the only way people will ever know who we truly are. James closed the notebook, his heart heavy. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of something. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe it was recognition. Whoever had written this had experienced something similar to what he had, a loss that couldn't be mended, a life forever changed by grief. He had to know more. James sat with the notebook in his hands, staring at the worn cover. The stories inside were short, almost like journal entries, but each one carried a weight that tugged at him. He flipped to the front page, where the name Lucy was scrawled in large, looping letters. The girl must have left this here, but when and why? He glanced around the library, half expecting to see her sitting at one of the tables, but the only other people in sight were a mother and child, their soft voices a distant murmur. The librarian was busy at the desk, typing on her computer, unaware of the small mystery that had just fallen into James' lap. He turned back to the notebook, reading the first story again. It was about a girl who wandered through a forest, lost and unsure of where she was going, but somehow certain that she didn't belong where she had come from. The girl felt out of place, like a ghost passing through the world, invisible to those around her. James recognized that feeling all too well. As he read, he felt a strange sense of connection to this girl, Lucy. Her stories were filled with the kind of melancholy that only someone who had truly known loss could write about. There was a simplicity to her words, but also a profound understanding of how it felt to be alone in the world. It was as if her words were echoing his own thoughts back to him. James placed the notebook on the table and sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't felt this alive in months, hadn't cared about anything outside of his daily routine since Claire died. But something about this notebook had stirred him. He felt compelled to learn more about its owner. Who was Lucy, and what had led her to write these stories? He stood up, clutching the notebook in his hands, and made his way to the librarian's desk. She looked up, startled by his sudden approach. "Can I help you?" she asked, her polite smile returning. "Do you know who left this behind?" James asked, holding up the notebook. The librarian glanced at the notebook, frowning slightly. "I'm not sure. I've seen a lot of students leave things behind, but nothing like that." She paused, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. "It could belong to one of the girls from the high school. They sometimes come here to study. Do you think you could find out? I can check the lost and found records, but if it's been here for a while, there's not much I can do." James nodded, feeling a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. "I'll check back later," he said, though part of him knew that finding Lucy would be more complicated than just asking the librarian. As he walked back to his seat, James clutched the notebook tightly, feeling a strange sense of responsibility for it. He couldn't explain why, but something about Lucy's words had touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't know her, but somehow through her stories he felt like he did. The library's dim, comforting light washed over James as he returned to his favorite chair by the window, the notebook still clutched in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something important. This wasn't just a misplaced notebook. It was a piece of someone's life, left behind like a trail of breadcrumbs waiting to be followed. He opened the notebook again, flipping through the pages at random. Each story revealed a little more about the writer. Lucy's words were filled with longing and quiet sadness, but there was also a sense of strength beneath them, a determination to keep going even when life felt heavy. James felt that same weight in his own life. Days that dragged on, heavy with loss, but somehow still moving forward. As he read, he couldn't help but wonder, who was Lucy? What had she gone through to make her write these stories? And why had she left the notebook behind? Days passed, and James found himself returning to the library more frequently than ever before. Each visit was the same. He would sit in his usual spot, the notebook open in front of him, trying to piece together the fragments of Lucy's life. But she never appeared. He asked the librarian again, but there were no new clues. Lucy remained a mystery. The stories in the notebook continued to haunt him. One in particular stuck with him, a tale about a girl who built an imaginary world to escape the loneliness of her real life. In that world, she was never alone, never abandoned. She had friends, a family, people who cared about her. But the girl always knew it wasn't real, and when she closed her eyes at night, the loneliness crept back in. James found himself thinking about that story long after he left the library. It echoed his own feelings, in a way. Since Claire had passed, he had built his own kind of imaginary world, one where he didn't need anyone, where the quiet solitude of a library was enough to fill the emptiness inside him. But deep down, he knew that world wasn't real. He had been pretending, just like the girl in Lucy's story. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, after yet another fruitless visit to the library, James decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the arrival of autumn, and the rain fell in soft sheets around him. The park behind the library was nearly deserted, save for a few determined joggers. James wandered the paths, lost in thought, the notebook still tucked under his arm. He found a bench beneath a large oak tree and sat down, staring out at the empty park. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of something beyond the grief that had consumed him. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Lucy's words had planted a seed inside him, and now he found himself caring about what had happened to her, wondering if she was out there somewhere, feeling just as lost as he was. He pulled the notebook from under his coat and opened it, letting the rain patter against the edges of the pages. He reread the story about the imaginary world, and for a moment, he could almost hear Lucy's voice in his mind, soft, hesitant, but strong. He knew he had to find her, The next morning, James awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to excitement. His mind buzzed with possibilities as he made his way to the library, notebook in hand, determined to leave some kind of message for Lucy. If she had written these stories here, perhaps she would return. And if she returned, he wanted her to know that someone had found her words and cared about what they said. When he arrived, the library was as quiet as always. The librarian, who had become accustomed to James' frequent visits, gave him a polite nod as he passed the front desk. He headed straight for the corner where he had first found the notebook, his heart pounding a little harder than usual. He wasn't sure why this felt so important, but it did. It was as if something in the air had shifted, as if this was the beginning of something new. He found a blank piece of paper and a pen from the librarian's desk, and with a deep breath, he scribbled down a simple note. Lucy, I found your notebook. Your stories have meant a lot to me. I hope you come back to the library so we can talk. James. He read the note over several times, unsure if it said too much or too little. Should he have shared more? His own story? Or was this enough? He didn't want to scare her off, but he also didn't want to leave her with nothing. After all, Lucy's stories had touched something deep inside him, something he hadn't expected. He wanted her to know that her words mattered, even if they were written for herself. Satisfied, James folded the note and tucked it inside the notebook, leaving it in the same spot on the shelf where he had found it. He stood there for a moment, staring at the notebook, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. What if she didn't come back? What if she had moved on, leaving her words behind like a snake, shedding its skin? He forced himself to walk away, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his usual seat by the window. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. He tried to read, but his mind kept drifting back to the notebook, to Lucy, and to the questions he still couldn't answer. Where was she now? And why did he care so much about a girl he had never met? The next few days were agonizingly slow. Each time James returned to the library, he would check the shelf where he had left the note, but the notebook remained untouched. He began to lose hope, wondering if he had been foolish to think that Lucy would ever return. But then, on the 5th day, something changed. James arrived at the library just after noon, as usual, and made his way to the far corner. His heart skipped a beat when he saw that the notebook had been moved. His hands trembled as he reached for it, and when he opened the cover, he found his note still tucked inside, but underneath it, in small, neat handwriting, was a response. James, I didn't think anyone would care about my stories. Thank you. I don't know if I'm ready to talk, but maybe soon. I come here when I need to escape. Lucy. James read the note twice, his heart racing. She had returned. She had seen his message, and now there was a connection, however fragile it might be. He smiled to himself, feeling the warmth of something like hope spread through his chest. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. He carefully placed the notebook back on the shelf, leaving it open to the new message. He would wait. For as long as it took, he would wait for Lucy to return. The days that followed felt like a waiting game for James. Every afternoon, he would make his way to the library, sit by the window, and keep an eye on the corner shelf where Lucy's notebook rested. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a new note, maybe even Lucy herself walking in. But each day passed without event. The librarian had started to take notice of his routine, though she said nothing, offering only the occasional curious glance. On the 7th day after Lucy's response, James found himself once again standing in front of the shelf. His hands were steady as he pulled the notebook down, though his heart betrayed his calm demeanor, thudding against his chest with nervous anticipation. Had she written again? He flipped open the cover, and his breath caught in his throat. There, beneath the original message, was a second note from Lucy. James, I'm not really sure why I'm writing this. Maybe it's because I feel like you're the first person who's listened in a long time. I don't talk to people much. I've been moved around a lot, and it feels like everyone forgets me once I'm gone. Maybe that's why I started writing, so I wouldn't disappear completely. Lucy. James felt a pang in his chest as he read her words. He had suspected that Lucy's stories were more than just creative exercises, but this was the first time she had opened up about her real life. Moved around a lot. Forgotten. He could feel the weight of those words, the sense of displacement that must have haunted her. It resonated with him, in a way. After all, hadn't he felt like he had disappeared after Claire died? That sense of fading into the background, unnoticed and unimportant. He sat down at one of the nearby tables and pulled out a piece of paper. The library was quiet today, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound as he penned his response. Lucy, you haven't disappeared. I see you. Your stories made sure of that. I'm sorry that you had to move around so much. It's not fair to be treated like you don't matter. But you do. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. James. He placed the letter back in the notebook, his hands a little steadier this time. He didn't know if Lucy would respond again, but he hoped she would. He felt a growing connection to her, this mysterious girl who seemed to be drifting through life, like a shadow, much like he had been. And more than anything, he wanted her to know that she wasn't alone. For the first time in a long while, James felt like he was making a difference, no matter how small. James had expected Lucy's next note to take some time, but she surprised him. When he returned to the library the following day, the notebook had already been moved. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, scanning the page for her familiar handwriting. James, thank you. I didn't expect anyone to care. Most people don't. I've been in foster care for a few years now. My parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and I've been shuffled from home to home ever since. Some families were nice, but most didn't really want me. I guess it's hard for people to take in a teenager who's already been through so much. Writing helps me cope, I guess. It makes me feel like I have some control over my life, even when everything else is out of my hands. Sometimes I wonder if things will ever get better, or if this is just it, being passed around until I'm old enough to be on my own. Lucy. James sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the sadness in her words. He could imagine her, a young girl bouncing from one foster home to another, never feeling like she truly belonged anywhere. It reminded him of his own sense of displacement after Claire's death. He had lost his anchor, and in some ways, he had been drifting ever since. He thought about his response carefully before writing. Lucy, I can't imagine how hard it's been for you, but I can tell you one thing. You're not alone. I know it feels that way sometimes, like no one really sees you or cares what happens to you. But I see you. I know that's not much, but it's something. And things can get better, even when it feels like they won't. It's hard to believe that when everything seems so dark, but it's true. I lost my wife last year, Claire. She was my whole world. And when she died, I thought I would disappear too. But I didn't, and neither will you. James. As he placed the note back in the notebook, he felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't easy for him to talk about Claire, not even in his own thoughts, let alone with a stranger. But Lucy didn't feel like a stranger anymore. There was something about her that reminded him of himself, a kindred spirit lost in a world that didn't seem to care. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, with James returning to the library each afternoon, waiting for Lucy's response. He didn't tell the librarian what was happening, though he caught her eyeing him from time to time, as if she knew there was something different about his visits. When Lucy finally wrote back, her words were shorter, but no less impactful. James, I'm sorry about your wife. I know what it's like to lose the only person who makes you feel like you matter. I guess we're both kind of lost, huh? But thank you for saying that things can get better. I hope you're right. Maybe we'll both find our way out of this someday. Lucy. James read her notes several times, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. It was strange how connected he felt to this girl he had never met, as if their shared pain had woven an invisible thread between them. He wanted to help her, to guide her through the darkness, even though he was still finding his own way. He wasn't sure how to do that yet, but he knew he had to try. For the first time in months, James felt like he had a purpose. It wasn't just about keeping himself afloat anymore. It was about helping Lucy find her way too. And in doing so, maybe he could heal a part of himself that had been broken since the day Claire died. The library had become more than just a place to escape. It was now a lifeline, a bridge connecting two lost souls. And for the first time in a long time, James felt a glimmer of hope, faint but steady, that things could change. Maybe Lucy was right. Maybe they would both find their way out of this darkness, together. The connection between James and Lucy had grown steadily over the past few weeks, with their quiet correspondence through the notebook becoming something that anchored both of them. Each time he read her words, James felt a pull toward the girl, an obligation, perhaps, to do something more for her than just leave notes on pages. However, a dilemma gnawed at him. James had not seen Lucy in person, and part of him wondered if he ever would. It felt odd, like a relationship held together by threads, fragile and easily broken. He wanted to reach out to her, to see her face and hear her voice, but the uncertainty of how she might react held him back. He thought often about what Lucy had said in her last note, how she had apologized for his loss and acknowledged their shared feeling of being lost in the world. Lucy had shared more of her past, her struggles in foster care, and her sense of being passed from one family to the next like she didn't belong anywhere. Her words echoed in his mind, blending with his own memories of the months following Claire's death. James knew what it meant to feel disconnected from the world, and he couldn't stand the thought of Lucy going through the same thing alone. But what could he do? The notes weren't enough anymore. He knew that much. But trying to meet her seemed risky. He didn't want to scare her or push her away by making things too personal. Lucy had been clear about her need for space, and James respected that. But still, the thought nagged at him. He wanted to do more, to offer her something beyond the written words they exchanged. The library had become his sanctuary over these weeks, but was no longer just a quiet place to pass the time. It was where he and Lucy had built this fragile connection, where he had found a sense of purpose again. He sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves drift past outside, thinking about what he should do next. James was a man of few risks. After Claire, his world had shrunk down to the library, his home, and the memories that filled the spaces between. Reaching out to Lucy felt like stepping into unknown territory, something that both excited and terrified him. But if he didn't try, would their connection simply fade away? He didn't know how to navigate this. What did a man like him, a grieving widower in his 60s, have to offer a young girl struggling with loss and displacement? And yet, the pull to help her, to do more than just exchange notes, kept tugging at him. James knew he had to decide. Would he step out of his comfort zone for the sake of someone who might need him as much as he needed her? He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision press down on him. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would leave a new note. But this time, he would ask her if she wanted to meet. James arrived at the library the next day, his decision clear, but his nerves rattling him. The thought of finally asking Lucy if she wanted to meet filled him with a mix of hope and fear. Would she agree, or would it drive her away? He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer to find out. He wrote the note carefully, choosing his words with caution, and left it in the usual spot, tucked inside her notebook. The weight was unbearable. Each day that passed without a response left James more anxious than the last. He found himself checking the notebook obsessively, hoping that Lucy would leave a reply, but it remained untouched. And then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. James arrived at the library to find the librarian speaking with two women in low, concerned voices. Their expressions were serious, and the librarian glanced up at James as he entered, her face clouded with worry. She called his name softly and asked if he had a moment to speak. James approached the desk, his heart thudding in his chest. The librarian explained that Lucy had run away from her foster home. The foster family had come to the library, asking if anyone had seen her or knew where she might go. Lucy had been missing for 2 days, and no one had any idea where she could be. James felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. His mind raced with thoughts of where Lucy could have gone. He tried to think of anything she might have mentioned in her notes that could give him a clue, but nothing stood out. She had never spoken about any particular places she liked to go, only her feelings of isolation and displacement. The librarian, sensing James' concern, explained that the foster parents were hoping Lucy would turn up soon, but in the meantime, They were trying to contact anyone who might know something. James nodded numbly, his thoughts a blur. He had known Lucy only through her words on a page, and yet the thought of her out there, lost and alone, terrified him. As he left the library that day, James couldn't shake the sense of responsibility that weighed on him. Lucy had been struggling for so long, and now she had vanished, slipping away like the characters in her stories. He couldn't just sit back and wait for her to reappear. He had to do something. The next day, James retraced his steps to the places he thought Lucy might go. He walked through the park behind the library, searching the quiet corners where she might be hiding. He checked the bus station, the alleys behind a coffee shop, anywhere that seemed like a place someone might go to disappear. But there was no sign of her. That evening, as he returned to the library for the third time that day, James finally allowed himself to admit the truth. Lucy was gone, and he had no idea where to find her. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, filling him with a sense of helplessness that was all too familiar. He sat in his usual spot by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Lucy had run away, just as he had feared she might, and now he was left with nothing but the memory of their brief connection. He had wanted to help her, but it seemed like he had failed. The thought gnawed at him, deepening the sense of loss that had been with him since Claire's death. James remained at the library until closing time, hoping for some kind of sign, but there was nothing. As he left, he made one last stop at the shelf where Lucy's notebook still rested. He didn't open it this time. He couldn't bear to. Instead, he placed his hand on the cover, as if to offer some kind of silent apology, and then turned away. The night after learning about Lucy's disappearance, James hardly slept. His mind was a whirlpool of worry, guilt, and helplessness. He had no idea where Lucy might be or if she was safe. All he knew was that he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. She had trusted him, even if only through words on a page, and now that trust felt like a responsibility too great to ignore. The next morning, he left his house early, driven by a need to find her. He retraced his steps from the day before, starting at the park behind the library. The autumn leaves had fallen heavily overnight, blanketing the ground in shades of yellow and brown. The benches were empty, the air thick with the stillness of early morning, but there was no sign of Lucy. James moved on, walking through the alleys behind the coffee shop, checking the bus station again. He found himself looking at every shadowed corner, every quiet space, hoping for some hint of where she could be. But Lucy remained elusive, like the ghost she had once described herself as in her stories. By mid-afternoon, James was back at the library, exhausted and frustrated. The librarian greeted him with a concerned look, but there was no new information. She said that Lucy's foster family had filed a report, but so far, the authorities hadn't found anything either. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Sitting in his usual spot by the window, James thought back to all the notes he and Lucy had exchanged. He replayed her words in his mind, trying to piece together any clues she might have left behind. Her stories often spoke of escape, of finding places to hide where the world couldn't touch her. But those were just stories, weren't they? James rubbed his eyes and tried to focus. Lucy had run away because she felt unseen, like no one cared. He remembered how she had written about being passed around from one foster family to the next, each one treating her like a temporary burden. She had described it as feeling invisible, like a person without a place. The thought struck him suddenly. Maybe Lucy had gone somewhere she thought no one would ever look for her. Somewhere truly isolated, a place that mirrored the loneliness she had felt for so long. James racked his brain for ideas. He knew Lucy didn't have many friends, and she had never mentioned visiting any particular places except the library. But her stories, those were different. They spoke of hidden places, abandoned spots where the world seemed to forget people. James stood up abruptly, the pieces of an idea starting to form. There was an old, abandoned train station on the outskirts of town, a place where no one ever went anymore. It was mostly forgotten, hidden behind a thicket of trees that had grown wild over the years. It wasn't far from the library. Lucy could have found it easily enough if she was looking for somewhere to disappear. With renewed determination, James left the library and headed toward the old station. James reached the outskirts of town as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees. The path to the abandoned train station was overgrown, the bushes and brambles thick with years of neglect. It had been years since anyone had come out this way. The station itself, once a small but bustling stop, had been left to rot, forgotten by the town as if it had never existed. He pushed through the thicket, his heart racing with anticipation. He had no idea if Lucy was there, but something inside him told him to keep going. The air was cold, and the wind whipped through the trees, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by Lucy, by the fear that she had run away and disappeared for good. As he neared the old station, James saw the crumbling platform, its edges jagged with broken concrete. The station building, little more than a shack now, stood silent and empty, its windows boarded up. It didn't look like a place anyone would go willingly. But then again, Lucy wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for a place where no one would find her. James stopped for a moment, catching his breath, and listened. At first, he heard nothing but the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the highway. But then, faintly, he thought he heard something else, a soft sound, barely audible over the wind. It was coming from the direction of the platform. He moved closer, his footsteps careful and slow. As he reached the edge of the platform, he saw her. Lucy was sitting on the ground, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She was staring straight ahead, not moving, as if she were part of the station itself, another forgotten thing left behind by the world. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and James could see the streaks of dried tears on her cheeks. For a moment, James didn't know what to say. The sight of her there, so small and vulnerable, broke something inside him. He wanted to call out to her, to say something that would make it all better, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he walked slowly toward her, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. When he was close enough, he said her name, softly, hoping not to startle her. She didn't respond at first, didn't even turn her head, but after a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She said she didn't know why she had come here, and that it felt like the only place that made sense. Lucy said she was tired of running, tired of feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. She had wanted to disappear, to slip away into the cracks where no one would notice her. She said that no one ever stayed, and no one ever really cared. James knelt beside her, listening to her words with a heavy heart. He told her that she was wrong. He told her that he cared, that he had been looking for her because she mattered. James said that she wasn't invisible, that her stories had touched him in ways she couldn't understand. He told her about how lost he had felt after Claire died, how he had wanted to disappear too, but how finding her notebook had brought him back to life. Lucy listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the ground. James could see the tears welling up again, but she didn't wipe them away. She simply sat there, letting his words sink in. He told her that she didn't have to run anymore, that she didn't have to hide. She could come back, and they could figure things out together. After what felt like an eternity, Lucy finally lifted her head. She looked at James, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She said she didn't know if she could trust him, that everyone who had ever cared about her had left in the end. Lucy said she was scared that he would too. James shook his head and said that he wasn't going anywhere. He promised her that. He told her that she didn't have to be alone anymore, that they could face whatever came next together. Lucy said that she didn't know if she could trust it, if she could trust him. She said she had been hurt too many times, abandoned by too many people, to believe that anything good could last. Her voice was quiet, but the vulnerability in her words was palpable. James didn't hesitate. He said that he understood her fears, that trust wasn't something that came easily after everything she had been through. But he said that he was willing to earn it, however long it took. He told her that he wasn't going anywhere, and that no matter what she decided, he would always be there for her. There was a long silence between them, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Lucy said that she wanted to try. She said she didn't know if it would work, but she wanted to believe in what he was offering. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have the kind of life she had only ever dreamed about. James smiled, relief flooding through him. He told her that they would take it one step at a time, that they didn't have to figure everything out all at once. He said that the most important thing was that they were in this together. Lucy nodded, her expression softening as she looked at him. She said she was scared, but for the first time in a long time, she also felt a little hopeful. The adoption process moved faster than James had anticipated. Perhaps it was because Lucy's foster family was willing to let her go, or maybe it was because the system, flawed as it was, recognized that Lucy had found something stable with James. Either way, within weeks, the paperwork had been filed, and Lucy was officially part of his life. The change wasn't immediate, of course. They both knew that their lives wouldn't transform overnight just because they now had legal papers binding them together. But there was a shift, a quiet, subtle shift in the way they interacted. Lucy began to come to James' house more often, first just for visits, then gradually staying for longer stretches of time until one day, she moved in. It was a strange feeling for both of them. James, who had lived alone since Claire's death, now found himself adjusting to the presence of someone else in his home. The house had always felt too big, too empty. Now, with Lucy there, it began to feel alive again. The sounds of her footsteps in the hall, the sight of her curled up on the couch reading, the simple fact that someone else was there to fill the silence, it all made the house feel like a home once more. Lucy, too, seemed to be adjusting. She was quieter than most teenagers, more reserved, but James could see the small signs that she was beginning to trust him. She still had moments of doubt, moments when she would pull away, retreat into herself, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But those moments were becoming fewer. The walls she had built around herself were slowly starting to come down. One evening, as they sat in the living room, James noticed Lucy staring out the window, lost in thought. He asked her what she was thinking about, and after a long pause, she said that she was thinking about what it meant to have a home. She said she had never really had one before, not a real one anyway. She said that she was scared to believe that this could be it, that this could be the place where she belonged. James nodded and told her that he understood. He said that when Claire had died, he had felt like he had lost his home, too. The house had been just a house, an empty shell without her. But now, with Lucy there, it was different. It was starting to feel like a home again, and he told her that she was a part of that. Lucy didn't say anything at first, but then she said that she wanted to believe him. She said that she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was where she was meant to be. James smiled and told her that she didn't have to rush. He said that they had all the time in the world to figure it out, and that no matter what, she would always have a place with him. Over the following weeks, things began to settle into a new kind of normal. Lucy started school again, and although she was nervous at first, James could see that she was beginning to find her footing. The library remained their shared sanctuary, the place where their connection had first formed, and they still visited it often. But now, instead of exchanging notes in a hidden notebook, they talked openly about their lives, their fears, and their hopes for the future. One afternoon, as they walked through the park behind the library, Lucy said something that stopped James in his tracks. She said that she had never expected to find someone like him, someone who would care about her even when she felt invisible. She said that she didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a future at all. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He said that she had changed his life, too. He told her that finding her notebook that day had been a turning point for him, that she had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't had since Claire passed. He said that they had saved each other, in a way. Lucy nodded, her expression soft. She said that she was starting to see that now, starting to believe that maybe things really could get better. As they walked back toward the library, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having all the answers or knowing exactly what the future would bring. It was the peace that came from knowing that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. And neither was Lucy. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Lucy continued to grow, to heal, and to find her place in the world. James, too, found himself slowly letting go of the past, allowing the memories of Claire to coexist with the new life he was building with Lucy. The house that had once been filled with silence and grief was now a place of laughter and warmth. It wasn't perfect. There were still difficult moments, still days when the weight of the past pressed down on them. But it was better. They were both better. James knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and fear. But now, they faced those challenges together. And for the first time, they both felt like they had found their way out of the darkness. Lucy had a home, and James had a family again. If you enjoyed the Library of Memories, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this. We'd love to know, what part of this story impacted you the most? Was it the bond between James and Lucy, the idea of finding family in unexpected places, or something else? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, feel free to leave suggestions for stories you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps shape the future of this channel, and we can't wait to bring more stories to life with your input. Thanks for being part of our community,